Hey guys, continuing in this stuff about John, uh, I want to read some things to you from the Anchor Bible dictionaries. Um, I got all of them. They're kind of expensive, but they offer a lot of, I think, pretty in-depth information on a lot of stuff. And it's not overly skewed, I guess is why I like it. They kind of lay out what the text is saying, in different subjects and like that. It's a collection of knowledge, I guess you would say. I definitely don't treat it as the end all of anything, but I think it illuminates a lot of stuff in a condensed manner. The first thing I want to point out, if you go back and you look at the commentaries, the Jewish ones like Rashi and stuff like that on Genesis 1, I don't see where they were struggling to define what the word was. And I don't think, they definitely viewed it as more of a command structure, like I had pointed out in the other video. That seemed to be the case. And like when you read Rashi on on Genesis 1, he really doesn't even mention anything in the commentary part about the word being anything. It's just blatantly taken as a straightforward command. I think John would have shared this understanding, the commands of God. Um, and looking back, I don't see where John would provide any evidence that I think everyone agrees in some form he's referencing Genesis 1 in some way. I think it's more than other people think, but if he's referencing at all, and the word is part of that reference, I don't see any evidence that he's putting forth a different definition of what that may be. So, with that being said, I just want to read from 3 sections. I don't know how long this is going to turn out to be. But the first part I want to read is Cerinthus, because some people were questioning the whole, this is stuff I had read, and Wikipedia did a good job of condensing it, but people were kind of nitpicking at it, so I'll take it from this more scholarly source. Um, it says, a Gnostic teacher who lived in Asia Minor about 100 AD, Irenaeus says that Cerinthus believed the world was created by a power separated from and ignorant of the true God. He also taught that Jesus was the son of Joseph and Mary. At baptism, the Christ descended on Jesus from the true God. He then proclaimed the unknown Father and performed miracles. Since Christ was a spiritual being incapable of suffering, he left Jesus before the crucifixion. Jesus suffered and rose again. Hippolytus differs little from Irenaeus. He claims that Cerinthus was trained in the teaching of the Egyptians. See the discussion in Wright, 1984, and what he called the power that created the world, an angel. Pseudo-Tertullian adds that Cerinthus believed that the law was given by angels. According to Eusebius' sources, Cerinthus taught that the kingdom of Christ would be set up on earth with its center in Jerusalem. Several sources associate Cerinthus with Simon Magus. Irenaeus also reports that John wrote his gospel against the teaching of Cerinthus. He quotes Polycarp as saying that one day when John was going to the bathhouse at Ephesus, he heard that Cerinthus was there. John rushed out saying he was afraid the bathhouse would fall because the enemy of truth was inside. Eusebius knew some who claimed that Cerinthus wrote the Apocalypse of John. Athanasius refuted those who held Cerinthus wrote the Apocalypse and Gospel of John. Later writers tended to associate Cerinthus with the Ebionites and described him in Jewish Christian terms. Actually, I won't read no more of that. So that's kind of the overview of Cerinthus from scholarly sources. And I think that when you look at it, it's kind of what we've been saying, in general, what we've been saying about it. And let me see here. So, going on. Now, the section for Logos in this book is massive. So I'm definitely not going to try and read all of this to you. It's pages long, and the print's pretty small. And it goes from the Jewish conception to the New Testament and post-New Testament usages and everything in between. What I do want to focus in on is just two parts of it. The Logos and the Septuagint, because they really don't have a section that goes into Judaism any more than that. And I want to focus on the Logos and Hellenistic Jewish speculation. So it starts off, the Logos and the Septuagint. Logos was used frequently in the Septuagint. It was used to translate a number of Hebrew words. Amir 13 times, Milah, word 30 times. Over 90% of the time, however, Logos was a translation of the Hebrew word debar. With Logos and another Greek word, rima, were used to translate debar. Rima predominates in the Pentateuch. Logos is 56 times, rima is 147. In Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, they occur about equally. Logos 26, rima 30. In other biblical books, Logos predominates. Logos is 1065 and rima is 352. This is especially true for the prophetic books. Logos is 320 times, rima is 40. And wisdom literature, Logos is 221, rima is 40. One reason for the shift was due to the differences in literary genre. In secular Greek, rima carried less of the meaning of oracle or proverb than did Logos, meanings which were central to prophetic and wisdom literature respectively. Yet rima was sometimes used in the Septuagint with the meaning of oracle, such as in Isaiah 16, 59, 66, Jeremiah 1, 6, 10, 1, 6, and 16, and Proverbs 3, 7, 8, Ecclesiastes 1, 7, and Sirach 39, or Sirach. And I'm leaving out the verse, I'm just giving you the chapters. This suggests that there may have also been another reason for the shift from rima to Logos, because of the prophetic and wisdom literatures were translated into Greek later than the Pentateuch. This shift from rima to Logos and the preponderance of Logos in prophetic and wisdom literature may reflect to some extent the growing influence on Hellenistic Judaism of the Judaism of the Hellenistic culture and philosophy, where their emphasis was on Logos. Logos in the Septuagint, like the Hebrew debar, had a wide range of meanings. It meant narrative, speech, dialogue, oracle, or proverb. Because the Hebrew debar and the Greek logos, however, did not have identical range of meanings, the use of logos as a translation of the Hebrew debar inevitably influenced the way which logos was understood. In the Septuagint, logos often took on a more dynamic meaning than it originally had in the Greek. Isaiah 2:3, and the word of the Lord will go forth from Jerusalem. Isaiah 45, 23, my words, logos, will not be frustrated. Psalms 119:74, for I have hoped in your words. Psalms 147:15, his word will run swiftly. There is a sense of power and dynamism in this use of logos that was not part of the semantic range of secular Greek. In addition, logos, and particularly the plural logoi, were used to refer to the Mosaic Law, Exodus 19 and Deuteronomy 1. In several Psalms, 33 and 6, and in Sirach 39:17, 31 and 43:10 and 26, logos was associated with God's act of creation and his maintenance of the cosmic order. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all their host by the breath of his mouth, Psalm 33:6. And his word the water stood in a heap. At his word the water stood in a heap, and the reservoirs of the water at the word of his mouth. At his command whatever pleases him is done, and none can limit his saving power. Sirach 39. Because of him his messenger finds the way, and by his word all things hold together. Sirach 43. While logos in each of these passages refers to God's command, see Genesis 1:3, 1:6, 1:9, 1:11, 1:14, 1:20, 1:24, 1:26. And that would be the "and God said," and not directly to some cosmic principle of order. The association of God's logos with creation and cosmic order was an important influence on the use of logos in Hellenistic Judaism literature and speculation. In this way, logos also played a role similar to that played by wisdom in other biblical texts, such as Proverbs 8:22 through 31 and Sirach 24, although in a much less developed fashion. So the part I'd hone in on here is, I agree with what they're saying. The Logos in each of the passages listed as Genesis 1, 3, 6, 9, 11, 14, 20, 20, 24, 26 is it's not directly using the principle of order. It's associated with his command. It's the actual command. And then we see that it's used for the word, the law of Moses. Okay. And what they're saying here that I'm taking away from this is that Logos began to change from the bar. Logos had usages that the bar did not have. And I think, I don't see a wisdom literature in Genesis 1. And if John is referencing that, I don't see where he gives any evidence for me to reconsider what word actually means. Now, the second part I want to read is the part in Hellenistic Jewish speculation. Logos became a much more important concept in Hellenistic Judaism and reached its climax in the writings of Hellenistic Jewish exegete Philo of Alexandria from 20 to 50 BCE, 20 BCE to 50 CE. Although the beginnings of this process are lost to us, fragments from the Hellenistic Jewish writer Aristobulus 150 BCE indicate that this process had begun, although tentatively by the middle of the 2nd century. So they're pointing out that a speculation that didn't seem to be too present in the Septuagint understanding was starting to roll out, and that makes sense to me. It was being modified, basically. Aristobulus, who is mentioned in 2 Maccabees 1:10, was an Alexandrian Jewish exegete who sought to interpret the Septuagint in a way consistent with Greek philosophy, primarily Stoic philosophy, but also included Platonic and Pythagorean elements. In one fragment, in which he offered an interpretation of Genesis 1, 3, 6, and 9, Aristobulus claimed that Moses called the whole Genesis of the world the words of God. In another fragment, Aristobulus connected wisdom, Sophia, with a metaphorical interpretation of the 7th day of creation, because according to his interpretation, all things are contemplated in the light of wisdom, just as all things are contemplated in the light of the 7th day mentioned in Genesis 2. Okay, that's definitely a Gnostic understanding. And that's kind of what, as this seems to be going. He then went on to connect the 7th day with the sevenfold Logos, which is the principle of order in the world. That's according to Eusebius. For Aristobulus, then, both wisdom and Logos serve similar cosmological ordering functions. The connection between wisdom and Logos was also made explicitly, although again in an incoherent way. And this wisdom of Solomon, a Hellenistic Jewish text from perhaps the 1st century BCE, Egypt or Syria. God's word and God's wisdom are used in the text as two parallel ways of describing God's creation of the world and his creation of human beings. That would be in Wisdom chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. It was, however, in the works of Philo of Alexandria that the Logos found its full flowering into Hellenistic Jewish literature. Philo of Alexandria came from the prominent Jewish family in Alexandria, and on the basis of his writings, obviously had a very good education in Greek philosophical literature. In his writings, which are primarily interpretations of the Septuagint and the Pentateuch, since he probably knew no Hebrew, he sought to interpret the Mosaic Law in the light of Greek, primarily Middle Platonic philosophy. The concept of Logos played a central role in this interpretation. Philo's use of Logos must be seen within the tradition of the Hellenistic Jewish wisdom speculation, since Philo, in continuity with his predecessors, identified wisdom, Sophia, with Logos, the word, and gave both some of the same attributes, e.g., the image of God. For Philo, the Logos was an intermediate reality between God, who was essentially transcendent, and the universe, while Philo could use the Stoic concept of the Logos as the principle of rationality that pervades the universe. Philo's Logos primarily fits into the pattern of the intermediate figure found in most Middle Platonic systems. Philo depicted the Logos in a variety of ways, and the figure had a number of different functions. The first general function was cosmological. The Logos was the image of God, the highest of all beings who were intellectually perceived, the one closest to God, the only true existent. This image, the Logos, also served as the paradigm or model for the ordering of the rest of the universe. The Logos was an image in a twofold way, a reflection of the truly existent God above and a model on the basis of which the rest of the universe below was ordered. The Logos was the archetypal idea in which all other okay, this is the important part. The Logos was the archetypal idea in which all of the other ideas were contained. That kind of sounds what's being said. It's within God. All things are contained in his thoughts. And we're calling that the Word in this other understanding, is that the Word contained everything God wanted to do. So it was the container for all the thoughts of God. But the Logos was not simply the image or the paradigm according to which the universe was ordered. It was also the instrument through which the universe was ordered. Kind of still saying the same thing. The pre-existent thought of God I hope, I'm just going to keep on reading. The Logos was both the power through which the universe was originally ordered and the power by which the universe continued to be ordered. Still kind of sounds like this other understanding to me. It's all the stuff that's in God's mind. Philo called these two aspects of the Logos the creative power and the ruling power, and he connected the first with the name Elohim, and the second with the Lord, Elohim, God, and Kyrios, Lord. The Greek word used to translate Yahweh in the Septuagint are other terms used by Philo to refer to Logos as are the first begotten Son of the uncreated Father, the chief of the angels, the high priest of the cosmos, and the man of God. What was common to all of these designations of the Logos was the intermediate role that the Logos played between the transcendent God and the rest of the universe. The second function of the Philonic Logos was anthropological. The Logos was the paradigm according to which human beings were made, not human beings as a whole, but only the mind. In interpreting Genesis 1:27, Philo noted that man was not created as the image of God, but according to the image of God. He interpreted this to mean that man was created according to the paradigm, which was the image of God. For Philo, this paradigm was the Logos, and man was an expression at third hand, or the God-Logos human mind of the Maker. In addition, a correspondence existed between the microcosm human being and the macrocosm universe. The human mind was the rest of the human being, the irrational parts of the soul and the body, as the Logos was to the cosmos as a whole. The human mind not only had a paradigm in the Logos, it also, in some fashion and fragment, had effluence of the divine Logos. The third function of the Philonic Logos was anagological. This is, the Logos was meant to guide the human soul to the realm of divine. For Philo, the goal of the human soul was the knowledge and vision of God, to become like God or to be assimilated to God. The possibility of the human soul attaining the knowledge and vision of God was rooted in the soul's fundamental relationship to the participation in the divine Logos. Participation into the divine mind, the thing that contains the thoughts of all things. Recognizing nonetheless relationship with the divine, must realize that the divine is ultimately the author of everything that the human soul is capable of. Once the human soul has realized this and turns to God, it can detach itself from the body and the realm of sense of perception and mystically rise above the material world and free to contemplate the divine Logos. or the divine mind. And in some very limited sense, even God himself. In this process, the divine Logos is the means and the guide to all the mystical ascent. Because the Logos functions in such a complex way in Philo's biblical interpretations, it is often difficult to understand precisely what he meant by those interpretations. And the Logos, is the Logos only a metaphor for God's power? Hypostantiation of the Logos only some aspect of God, or reality distinct from it, not independent of God? Is the Logos personal or impersonal? The answer to these questions can never be altogether clear. One reason for this is that Philo was rooted in a larger tradition of interpretation, and some of those interpretations were derived from the tradition and were not completely integrated in his own thought. But a basic sense of what Philo meant can be gained by paying attention to the kind of language he used and why he used it. Like other Middle Platonists, Philo thought that God, in his essence, could not be implicated in the material universe. At the same time, the relative order of the material universe had to derive, at least indirectly, from God. For Philo, the Logos served as the intermediate metaphysical reality through which the universe was originally ordered and by which it continued to sustain it in an orderly state. On the one hand, then, the Logos was not simply a metaphor. It was meant to serve as a real explanation, one which safeguarded both the transcendent of God and the relative order of the universe. On the other hand, it was not a straightforward description of a being other than God. It was a real aspect of divine reality, through which God was related, although indirectly, to the universe. In much the same way, the Logos cannot aptly be characterized as either personal or impersonal. It was rather the source of intelligence transcended through the universe. In that sense, also went beyond the categories of either personal or impersonal. In this respect, Philo was very much like other Middle Platonists, which also maintained both transcendence of God and God's indirect relationship to the universe through the use of an intermediate metaphysical reality. Hope I didn't stumble over it too many times. It's a lot of little words, but you see what my point is? The Septuagint understanding before Hellenistic Judaism seems to be very straightforward. It's about the commands, and personally, I don't know if a Jew, and just to me, would have went poking around in God's head, trying to say, what God was thinking ahead of time. And, it just seemed like something that may have been off limits to them. And they just simply took it as the law, the Torah. And I think that gets overlooked in this whole thing. But as you listen to all this stuff about the Hellenistic Jewish speculation, which to me wouldn't have been John. I don't think John was a Hellenistic Jew. I think that you see a lot more in common with the Logos idea being, the rationality, the God mind, one saying the mind of God, and the other one saying the God mind, all rationality, everything God purpose for the universe. It's more of a Hellenistic understanding that seemed to come later. Once again, reference the Jewish commentaries. They don't even talk about the word in Genesis because to them, I think it's a given. It's not something to get tied up about. It's very straightforward. The commandments of God. That was the Torah. That was the laws of Moses. That was when he said, "Let there be light." These words stand forever because God has the power to make them happen. And I see a lot more in common with Greek philosophical ideas and saying that the plan, basically, the purpose, God's plan created everything. Remember, whether you want to say it's he or she or it, verse 3 and verse 10 both contain the word dia as a genitive. And once again, my understanding of that is the cause. So not just the cause, that's the means of. So you're saying, I guess, in a way that God created by means of his plan. And I think I would take it as God created by means of his power, his word. His power upholds his word is how I would look at it. So that's just very small amount of information about the whole thing. And maybe I'll read other sections in this at other times. I don't want to cram it all into one thing, because they have some very interesting stuff when they start going with the wisdom literature in Hellenistic Judaism, and some of the notes that they have about the Johannine literature and the Logos, and that parts of it seem to have been added, the parts about John, so it may not have originally been there, and that's not the first time I've come across that kind of argument. And it talks about the first epistle of John and all this other stuff. But actually, I'll read this little part to you because it's not too long, and I won't go into the Targum and the Midrash and stuff because they talk about that. But they have a section specifically on the Logos and the prologue of the Gospel of John. While some scholars think that the prologue of John 1:1 through 18, is a unified whole and the work of the author of the Gospel of John, most think that there are literary stages to the prologue that would include John Brown, Boltman, John Marek. They give a bunch of names. Behind the present form of the prologue lies a hymn, which has been commented on and added to in order to be used as the beginning of the Gospel of John. There is a general consensus that verses 6 through 8 and verse 15, all of which are about John the Baptist, are later additions that serve to integrate the hymn into the present form of the Gospel of John, which originally began with the figure of John the Baptist. In addition, many scholars think that verses 12c through 13 and verses 17 through 18 are explanatory comments which did not belong to the original hymn. While the structure of the original hymn is a matter of debate, one can plausibly argue that it fell into 3 strophes. In the first strophe, the Logos was with God at the beginning and was God, and was the means through which the universe and life came to be. In the second strophe, that would be 10 through 12, the Logos came to its own, was not received by its own, but to those who received it, Logos gave power to become children of God. In the third and final strophe, the Logos became flesh in Jesus of Nazareth, and the glory of the Logos was experienced by those who believe. John 1:10 to 12 originally referred to the presence of the Logos prior to the incarnation. And only in John 1:14, 16, and 16 was the incarnate Logos referred to. When the hymn, however, was later connected to the Gospel of John, and John 1:6 through 9, about John the Baptist was inserted before John 1:10, everything after John 1:5 now came to be understood as referring to the incarnate Logos, perhaps because the redactor of the Gospel wanted to see everything from the point of view of the incarnate Logos. And how one understands the meaning of Logos in the hymn depends on a great extent of what religious and intellectual background one thinks the prologue should be set against. There are a variety of proposals in this area, and I'm going to stop. I might, like I said, later read that. But my thing is, Genesis 1, to me, is an illustration of the commands. And to me, if we're going to change that, if we're going to say that it's basically the thoughts contained within the mind of God, the intellect of God, and in other words, before he created everything, he thought, boom, 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 here's everything laid out in existence. And, we start learning that. I don't see where John supplies any language to change that. I think if he's quoting Genesis 1, he can't go back and redefine it. I think John would have been defined by Genesis. And I think the Jewish understanding of the word as a whole was not this big complicated mess. It was not, whether someone agrees with me or not, they can't change the fact that primarily word is based around commands. That's kind of the primary thing it was used for in Judaism. And when I kind of break it down, what John's doing, that word, it contains a lot of things. And that word created, and that word was God, slapped to the face of Gnosticism. The true light, and I did some videos, I had forgotten about this, but I do have some videos called Standalone Study on the Light, and there's 4 of them. And I go through the Bible. And true light always comes back to be God somehow. Israel's called the light of the nations. Well, there's a reason they're the light of the nations. And we see it in Revelation, and you see it in Genesis. It always comes back to God. And I think that's his second insult by using this language, is saying, well, the true light's coming into the world. That's another idea that would have been completely abominable and impossible to the Gnostic. God cannot interact with this world directly. And then he tells you the word became flesh. And then he tells you about the baptism. And I think that's when God entered the world. And he spends, I think he spends most of the gospel explaining how this works, how God was in the world. And Jesus is saying it, if you don't believe that I'm telling you the truth that I heard from God, then believe the works that I do. Why? Because they prove I am in the Father and the Father is in me. And I take that in a kind of a literal sense. I don't just say, well, it's his word, the word of the Father. I think the Father is actually there. I think he's actually there. Why did Thomas say the Lord of me, the God of me? If there weren't two people actually there, as much as God could be in the world without destroying us. And so I'm gonna stop. I don't want to go too long, but that's kind of my thoughts. I think the Septuagint understanding that they gave in the Anchor Bible is pretty much straightforward. It's the commands, and that's primarily how it's used most of the time. It's used of the law. The word to a Jew would have been the word at creation. I don't think people are giving any credence to how they thought about that. They thought the Torah was always there, the commandments of God, and even Rashi says that he could have skipped Genesis and all that and just started with Moses. The mere fact he's giving you this other stuff is just to let you know what happened. But it was always there. The Torah was always there. And they believe he created by that Torah. The word and the Torah are kind of the same thing. They're both commands. So they share a lot of similarities in that way. And I'm struggling to see why John would redefine the Jewish concept of word without saying anything. And I think there was a comment, me and Brother Kel were talking a little bit through comments, and he made that statement that, he doesn't see how you can have one definition of God in John 1, and then 2 words later have God again and totally redefine it without, he would have to explain. If you're going to redefine something, I think you have to explain it. And I would say the same thing about the word. John just starts out and says, in the beginning was the word. Well, what word? What is he talking about? And I think we have to rely on his Jewish understanding. In the beginning was the command of God, the actual command. And that embodies a lot of things, but I don't see where he's defining this kind of wisdom thing, And yes, wisdom was spoken about in the Old Testament, but the word at Genesis doesn't seem to really have too much in common. They're all connected, but it doesn't seem to be directly connected to the wisdom of God that you find in Proverbs. Yes, he creates through his wisdom. I understand that. And you see, yes, word comes through the Spirit. I agree. So yeah, I see that there's the senses of it all tied up together. But John doesn't define this to me. He doesn't really say, well, here's what I mean by word. It's like there's a preconceived notion. This is what I think John should be saying. And I'm saying that he is referencing Genesis. And that's where I'm going to plant my flag as far as understanding what the word was. It was a command. It was a maybe verbal, maybe not verbal. But it was a command that went out from God. It was upheld by his Spirit. And you kind of see that. In his word, in his command was life, and the life was light of men. The true light, which gives light to all, or life. See, if life is within the light, there's only one person who gives it to all men, and that's God. No one believes that Jesus is going to give life or light to all men. I think he's talking about at that time, at creation. And then coming forward, God gives life to all men. And what happens when you die? You give it back to God. That spirit returns to God. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of maybe Jewish type ideas going on right there, but I'm just not seeing it so far. So I hope you enjoyed. And like I said, I may do some others and go into this Aramaic thing that people or some people are harping on. I'm not a huge fan of that. the Aramaic argument. But anyway, be as it may, I hope you enjoyed and learned a little something at least. God bless.